Sandra Bullock walks into a fashion show. And what happens next will leave you speechless. The energy in Paris was electric that night. The crisp September air carried the scent of fresh flowers, meticulously arranged at the entrance of the Palais de Tokyo, one of the most prestigious venues for high fashion. The red carpet shimmered under the relentless flashes of cameras, each capturing the grandeur of Hollywood's finest. And then, she arrived. Sandra Bullock stepped onto the carpet, her presence unmistakable, not for extravagant couture or over-the-top glamour, but for something far more powerful, effortless grace. Dressed in an impeccably tailored beige gown, she was a vision of timeless elegance. While others dripped in sequins and bold, avant-garde ensembles, Sandra stood apart, not because she sought attention, but because true confidence never needs to beg for it. Cameras turned. Flashbulbs intensified. "Sandra, over here," photographers called out. She met them with a warm, genuine smile, a subtle wave, never overdone. Her makeup? Understated. Her hair? Soft waves cascading effortlessly over her shoulders. She wasn't here to compete. She was here to be herself. But not everyone appreciated her quiet sophistication. As Sandra took her seat in the front row, reserved only for the most distinguished guests, a murmur spread through the crowd. Just a few seats away, two impeccably styled influencers exchanged amused glances. "That's Sandra Bullock, right?" one scoffed, her voice dripping with condescension. "Yeah, but seriously, beige?" At this event, the other whispered back, struggling to suppress a smirk. They thought they were being discreet. They weren't. She was huge in the 90s, but let's be real, her time has passed. Sandra heard every word. She didn't flinch. She had been in this world long enough to recognize the industry's obsession with fleeting relevance. Still, no matter how thick your skin is, words like that, they linger. And what those influencers didn't know, they weren't the only ones who overheard. Someone else was sitting just behind them. Someone whose mere presence could silence a room. Someone who was about to make them deeply regret their careless words. And in just a few moments, Keanu Reeves would change everything. What happens next will shock you, and Sandra Bullock's response will be something they will never forget. But before we get into that, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. And if you love stories like this, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow we have another one you won't want to miss. Now, back to the show. And just like that, Keanu Reeves silenced the room. For Sandra Bullock, fashion wasn't just fabric draped over a body, it was an art form, a reflection of culture, identity, and individuality. Every cut, every texture, every silhouette told a story. And tonight, as the show unfolded before her, she watched with the quiet admiration of someone who understood that beauty was more than just trends, it was a statement. The first model emerged at the end of the runway, draped in a structured, sophisticated ensemble. Cameras flashed in perfect unison, capturing every movement, every detail. Applause started softly, then swelled in waves, following the rhythm of the show. Model after model walked with precise synchronization, their faces unreadable, their poise effortless. Sandra studied each piece, the fluidity of movement, the daring interplay of fabrics, the meticulous craftsmanship. She clapped politely, absorbing the spectacle in full. But not everyone in the front row was watching with the same appreciation. "Oh, that's way too much," one of the influencers next to her muttered, rolling her eyes as a voluminous, translucent gown made its way down the runway. "I'd never wear that," the other scoffed, barely containing her laughter. "Looks like my grandma's curtains." Sandra heard them. She chose not to react. Fashion was subjective, she knew that better than anyone. But these two weren't here to admire the artistry, they were here to entertain themselves with cutting remarks. And then, it got personal. "But nothing tops this look sitting next to us, right?" One of them murmured, eyes flickering toward Sandra. The other chuckled, her gaze scanning Sandra's understated beige dress. "I know, right? It screams, I tried to be elegant, but picked the wrong decade." Sandra remained composed. On the surface, at least. She had been in this industry long enough to endure every shade of criticism. Back then, it came from tabloids. Now, it came from people with smartphones and Wi-Fi, their words reaching millions in seconds. Still, no matter how thick your skin is, some words cut deeper than others. And then, one of them crossed the line. It's kind of sad, isn't it? She used to be an icon. Now she's just another woman clinging to relevance. This time, Sandra felt the sting. Because deep down, that wasn't just an insult, it was a fear that haunted generations. The silent battle against invisibility. The unspoken rule that, at a certain age, women fade into the background while the world moves on without them. For the first time that night, she considered turning to them. Not to defend herself, but to challenge that shallow, disposable mindset they so proudly displayed. But she never got the chance. Because at that exact moment, someone behind them cleared their throat. It was subtle, deliberate, and heavy with intent. The influencers froze. Sandra felt it too, the moment the atmosphere shifted. The air grew heavier, charged with something unspoken. The silence wasn't casual anymore. It was thick. It was tense. They hadn't turned around yet. They didn't know who was sitting behind them. But Sandra did. She didn't need to look to recognize a presence like that. Slowly, she glanced over her shoulder. Keanu Reeves, seated directly behind them. Dressed in a sharp black suit, a crisp shirt with no tie. His hair slightly tousled, his posture effortless yet commanding. Keanu never sought attention, yet somehow, his presence alone demanded it. His expression was unreadable. Relaxed, yet deliberate. And then, his eyes, cool and unwavering, settled on the two women. And finally, he spoke. Funny. One word. That was all it took. The influencers tensed. One of them let out a forced, nervous laugh. Oh. Hi, she stammered, turning around with a bright, uneasy smile as if hoping, praying, that Keanu hadn't heard their conversation. But he had. He always did. Keanu tilted his head slightly, watching them for a beat longer than was comfortable. Then, with the kind of calm that was far more unnerving than anger, he asked, "What exactly did you find so funny?" Silence. A different kind of silence. The kind that weighed heavy. The kind that pressed down on you when you knew you had just made a mistake. The other influencer swallowed hard, shifting in her seat, suddenly struggling to find words. The show continued. Models kept walking. Music kept playing. But now, no one was watching the runway. Because the real spectacle was happening right there in the front row. Keanu Reeves just did something no one expected, and it left the room in complete silence. They knew something had shifted. One of the influencers, still clinging to a nervous smile, tried to salvage the moment. "Oh, nothing really, just making comments about fashion. You know how these events are, so many opinions flying around." Keanu's lips curved slightly, not in amusement, but in something far more unsettling. It wasn't a friendly smile. "I see," he said, his voice steady. "But I don't think you were talking about fashion." The air in the room tightened. "You were talking about a person." The moment he said it, the weight of his words settled over them like a heavy fog. The influencer who had spoken first opened her mouth as if to protest, but Keanu barely moved, lifting just one finger in a quiet, almost imperceptible motion that said, "Don't bother. And you were wrong." His tone remained calm, almost gentle. But there was an edge to it, unshakable, undeniable. Sandra sat perfectly still, watching it all unfold. Something inside her shifted. She had spent years brushing off these kinds of remarks, pretending they didn't affect her. But now, watching Keanu stand up for her, effortlessly, without hesitation, the emotion hit her like a wave. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel the need to defend herself. Because someone else was doing it for her. And not just anyone. Keanu. The influencers, on the other hand, were spiraling. The younger one fidgeted with her rings, suddenly unable to keep still. The other forced a laugh, though it wavered halfway through. "Oh, we didn't mean anything bad by it. It was just a joke." Keanu tilted his head slightly, considering her words. "A joke?" His expression didn't change, but his gaze sharpened. "Interesting. Because it didn't sound funny." Silence. Not just from them, from everyone. Nearby guests had taken notice. Stylists, designers, editors, they weren't watching the runway anymore. They were watching this. The shift in the night was undeniable. And Keanu knew it. He wasn't the type to seek out conflict. But he also wasn't the type to stay silent when something was wrong. Sandra knew that. And that meant more than she could express. She turned her gaze back to the runway, taking a breath, steadying herself. And then, she felt it. When she looked back at Keanu, he wasn't watching the influencers anymore. He was looking at her. And then something rare happened. Keanu Reeves smiled. Not a polite smirk. Not a casual grin. A real smile. Warm. Genuine. Full of something Sandra hadn't seen in a long time, understanding. He didn't need to ask it aloud. "Are you okay?" Sandra blinked slowly. Then she smiled back. "Yes." And just like that, as if nothing had happened, Keanu leaned back in his chair, relaxed once more. But the damage was already done. The influencers sat stiffly in their seats, staring straight ahead, their confidence shattered. Now, they were the ones out of place. And Sandra? Sandra didn't feel invisible anymore. The silence in the front row wasn't just discomfort, it was something deeper. A shift in power, in perception. The models continued down the runway, the dazzling couture still demanding attention, but from many in the audience. The real show had already happened. A few seats down, a well-known magazine editor, silver-haired, impeccably dressed, let out a deliberate HM and offered Sandra a brief, knowing smile. A quiet show of support. And others followed. A nod here. A glance there. What Keanu had done wasn't just about this moment. It was a reminder. A reminder that people were done being complicit in this kind of behavior. And the influencers? They knew it. The younger one, desperate to escape the tension, pulled out her phone, scrolling through Instagram like it was some kind of lifeline. The other leaned in, whispering urgently, too aware that people were still watching, that their reputation had just taken a serious hit. But then, she made a choice. A last-ditch effort to reclaim control. She forced a laugh, louder this time, exaggerated, trying to brush off the weight of the moment as if it had all been nothing. And then, she raised her voice just enough. But what happened next? That changed everything. And just like that, Sandra Bullock became unforgettable. The influencer, still desperate to regain control of the moment, let out a light, practiced laugh, tossing her hair back like it was all just harmless fun. Wow, people are taking things way too seriously, huh? Silence. She tried again, this time forcing an airy, dismissive chuckle. It was just a silly comment, no need for this whole vibe. She cast a glance toward Keanu, hoping, praying, for some kind of validation. But Keanu Reeves remained silent. Expression neutral. Unmoved. And somehow, that neutrality was worse than any direct response. The other influencer, realizing they were losing ground fast, turned to Sandra with a bright, overly rehearsed smile. "Oh, Sandra, we love you. Seriously, you're an icon. It was just a joke, I hope you didn't take it the wrong way." Sandra blinked slowly. She saw it for what it was, an attempt to rewrite the moment. To erase what had just happened. But the audience wasn't stupid. Keanu stayed quiet. He didn't need to say anything anymore. He had already said enough. Now, the choice was hers. For years, Sandra had chosen silence. had trained herself to ignore these moments, to let them roll off her back. Not this time. She turned, her movement deliberate. A faint smile touched her lips. But it wasn't warm. Then, in a voice as calm as it was sharp, she said, "Funny, because it didn't sound like a joke." The exact words Keanu had used earlier. The impact was immediate. The influencers stiffened. Their smiles faltered. The tension in the air thickened, pressing down on them. Sandra turned her gaze back to Keanu. He was already looking at her. He didn't smile. He didn't need to. Because in his eyes, there was something unspoken. A quiet acknowledgement. A message only she could read. "I knew you had this in you." And for the first time in a long, long time, Sandra felt something she hadn't in years. Seen. The show came to an end. Guests stood, murmuring about the collections, the designs, but some were still whispering about what had happened in the front row. The influencers? They disappeared quickly. Sandra, however, rose from her seat with ease, picking up her clutch without a rush. She had all the time in the world. And then, "Sandra, a moment?" She turned. A well-known journalist stood before her. Sharp. Respected. Always chasing the story. Sandra smiled. Of course. The journalist held up a small recorder, excitement flashing in her eyes. "I really want to talk to you about this. About how women in the industry are treated. About what happened here tonight." Sandra hesitated. For a second. But then, something inside her whispered, "It's time to speak." She nodded. "I think it's an important conversation." The journalist's smile widened. "Great. Because I think the world needs to hear it." As Sandra left the venue, heading toward the interview, her phone vibrated. A message. She unlocked the screen. "Good answer. See you at the premiere. K." Sandra smirked to herself. Then she walked forward. And she didn't look back. But the night wasn't over yet. First came the whispers. "She's here. It's been years since she's appeared at an event like this." Then, a familiar scent. Jasmine. Musk. A whisper of vanilla. Slowly, Sandra turned. And there she was. A woman who seemed to have stepped out of another time. Her silver hair shimmered under the event lights. Her posture, effortless yet commanding. The presence of Coco Chanel was unmistakable. Yes. Coco Chanel. The woman who redefined fashion itself. Even after all these years, her name still shaped the industry. And now, she was walking straight toward Sandra. The room fell silent. The influencers, still reeling from their earlier humiliation, watched in stunned disbelief. Because they knew. They were about to witness something far greater than themselves. Sandra rose from her seat, unsure of what to expect. But Coco? Coco knew exactly what she was doing. She stopped in front of Sandra. Locked eyes with her. And then, without hesitation, she took Sandra's hands in hers. A hush fell over the room. And then, Coco Chanel smiled. "My dear, you remind me what true elegance is." Sandra felt the weight of those words like a wave crashing over her. Because they weren't just words. They were validation. Coco Chanel, the Coco Chanel, was recognizing her. Not just as a star. Not just as an actress. As a woman who embodied something greater. True. Timeless. Elegance. The murmurs returned, but this time, they weren't whispers of gossip or judgment. They were whispers of admiration. A renowned fashion editor leaned toward a colleague, voice hushed yet urgent. She was just endorsed by Chanel. This is history happening right in front of us. The influencers? They turned pale. Because they understood what this meant. At that moment, they lost. whatever argument they had, whatever power they thought they held. Because in the world of fashion, there was no higher authority than Coco Chanel. And Coco had chosen Sandra. Sandra, still processing, managed a humble smile. That means a lot to me. Coco kept her hands on Sandra's, her gaze unwavering. And then she said something that would define the entire night. Elegance isn't about being seen. It's about being remembered. Sandra felt chills. Because suddenly, it all made sense. True value wasn't about demanding attention. It wasn't about standing louder than others. It was about being timeless. Just like Coco. And now, just like Sandra. The influencers? They sat stiffly in their seats. Forgotten. Sandra? She stood tall. Timeless. Elegant. And unforgettable. Sandra Bullock didn't just win the night, she became unforgettable. There was no point in apologizing now. No carefully crafted excuse, no nervous laugh, no desperate attempt to downplay the moment could change what had already been written in the eyes of everyone present. Sandra Bullock hadn't just come out on top. She had become something greater. And them? They had become irrelevant. Sandra felt a gaze on her. Instinctively, she lifted her eyes. Keanu was still there. Watching. Not surprised. It was as if he had known all along that this moment, this exact moment, was always meant to happen. And maybe he had. Because Keanu Reeves had always seen beyond the surface. Now, his expression was clear. I knew you had this in you. Sandra felt warmth rise in her chest. For the first time in a long time. She believed it too. She smiled at him. And Keanu, he smiled back. Coco Chanel took a step back, but her presence lingered, as if she had left something intangible in the air. She scanned the audience, her gaze sweeping over the faces watching in awe, taking in the weight of this moment. And then, with a knowing glint in her eye, she spoke. I have always believed that fashion is temporary, but style is eternal. Then, she turned back to Sandra. Locked eyes with her. Held the moment still. And delivered the final words of the night. And you, my dear, are eternal. The room erupted into applause. Not polite. Not obligatory. Thunderous. This time, there was no doubt. Sandra Bullock didn't need to fight for relevance anymore. She was relevance. And as the world began to talk, no, buzz, about this historic moment, Sandra's phone vibrated in her palm. A new message. She glanced down, unlocking the screen. You never had to prove anything to anyone. But it was beautiful to watch. K. A soft laugh escaped her lips as she shook her head. And then, without looking back, she walked forward. The night the fashion industry changed forever. The venue was still buzzing with conversation, but the focus was no longer on the runway. It was on her. Sandra's name was on everyone's lips. She hadn't just been defended by Keanu Reeves. She had been endorsed by Coco Chanel. And the influencers? Gone. Vanished into the crowd, their voices now insignificant. Sandra, on the other hand, stood at the center of it all. Admiring glances. Whispered praises. The energy had shifted, and she was the one who had set it in motion. Then, a journalist approached. Not just any journalist. Isabel Lauren. Renowned. Respected. Known for her sharp interviews and her ability to never miss a real story. Sandra, a moment? Sandra recognized her immediately. She adjusted herself with poise. Of course. They stepped aside, into a quieter corner of the venue. Isabel pressed the record button. What happened here tonight? It was unexpected, wasn't it? She asked, a small knowing smile tugging at her lips. Sandra returned the expression, pausing for just a moment before answering. I'd say it was inevitable. Isabel raised an eyebrow. Inevitable? What do you mean by that? Sandra took a deep breath before speaking. I've been through moments like this before. The entertainment and fashion industries have always demanded that women constantly reinvent themselves. Her gaze sharpened. As if we have an expiration date. Isabel leaned in slightly, intrigued. And yet tonight was different. Sandra's lips curved into something softer. Not because Keanu Reeves stepped in. She paused. Because I decided not to let it slide. Isabel jotted something down quickly, her expression unreadable. Do you think this moment could actually change something in the industry? Sandra considered her response carefully. Then, she said, change is already happening. A beat of silence. What happened tonight wasn't just about me. It was about every woman who has ever been dismissed as a joke simply for aging. For not desperately seeking attention. For staying true to herself. The weight of her words hung in the air. Isabel pressed stop on the recorder. And for the first time all night, she didn't have another question. She had her story. The aftermath, a shift in power. As Sandra stepped out of the event, the camera flashes flickered around her. But this time, she wasn't just another face in the crowd. She was a statement. The moment between her, Keanu Reeves, and Coco Chanel had already gone viral. And people weren't just talking about fashion anymore. They were talking about authenticity. About respect. About the kind of elegance that doesn't fade with time, but instead deepens. Strengthens. Becomes unshakable. For the first time in a long time, Sandra didn't feel like she was trying to hold on to relevance. She was defining it. By morning, the headlines had shifted. Luxury brands were rethinking their campaigns. Industry leaders were speaking out against the toxic culture of ageism. The public had chosen a side. One that celebrated women for who they truly were. And the influencers? Their voices had gone silent. Sandra didn't need to see their reaction to know the truth. Authenticity had won. That afternoon, an email arrived. The Paris Fashion Council wanted Sandra to deliver a keynote speech. Topic: timeless elegance and authenticity. For the first time in her career, she wasn't just a guest at the table. She was the one setting it. And as she stood by her window, looking out over the city that once dictated who was relevant and who wasn't, she realized something. Elegance isn't about the dress you wear. It's about the confidence with which you wear yourself. True beauty doesn't fade with time. It deepens. It strengthens. It becomes unshakable. And Sandra? She had never felt more powerful. Because real elegance isn't about being remembered for a moment. It's about being unforgettable. And she was.